Nadezhda Mandelstam recalls that her husband Osip, suffering from psychiatric stress, had, quote, an occasional desire to come to terms with reality and make excuses for it. He would say that he feared the revolution might pass him by if, in his short-sightedness, he failed to notice all the great things happening before our eyes, unquote. She immediately explains that this mood can't just reflect one person's psychiatric stress, since it was so widely shared. Quote, it must be said that the same feeling was experienced by many of our contemporaries, including the most worthy of them, such as Pasternak, unquote. Her most quoted sentence follows, quote, my brother Yevgeny Yakovlevich used to say that the decisive part in the subjugation of the intelligentsia was played not by terror and bribery, though God knows there was enough of both, but by the word revolution, which none of them could bear to give up. It is a word to which whole nations have succumbed, and its force was such that one wonders why our rulers still needed prisons and capital punishment, unquote. Nadezhda here describes a phenomenon sometimes called revolutionism, a love of revolution not as a mere means, but as a goal in itself. I first encountered the term in the famous anthology Landmarks, a collection of articles on the Russian intelligentsia in 1909, edited by Mikhail Gershenzon. Gershenzon and the other contributors describe a complex of feelings and attitudes characteristic of revolutionism. They could not know how revolutionism would evolve during and after the revolution itself. For convenience, we can first distinguish three kinds of revolutionism: the pre-revolutionary one described in Landmarks, a second experienced during the revolution and its immediate aftermath, and a third predominating after the new regime was established. There are no sharp dividing lines, of course. Nadezhda Mandelstam describes the third type, on which I intend to focus in this talk, after a glance at the second type, which Pasternak attributed to his character, Dr. Zhivago. When the Bolsheviks overthrow the provisional government, Zhivago muses, quote, above all, where does genius lie? This unprecedented thing, this miracle of history, this revelation comes bang in the very thick of the ongoing everydayness. Only what is great can be so inappropriate and untimely as revolution, unquote. But Zhivago soon recognizes that he has allowed words and abstractions to blind him. Then he muses, quote, only once in his life had this uncompromising language and single-mindedness filled him with enthusiasm. Was it possible that he must pay for this rash enthusiasm all his life by never hearing, year after year, anything but these unchanging, shrill, crazy exclamations and demands, unquote? What entranced Zhivago was a particular kind of time that anthropologist Victor Turner called liminality, a moment of transition when all definitions are in flux and everything seems possible. It is easy enough to see how revolution could seem like such a moment and so appeal to our imagination. We feel that life in its entirety can be reshaped right now, and that we will do the reshaping. To use Engels' famous phrase, this was the leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. With freedom here meaning not the power of the individual to do what he likes, but of the collective to reshape all life. As Trotsky argued, quote, communist life will not be formed blindly like coral islands, but will be built consciously. Life will cease to be elemental, unquote. Trotsky confidently predicted that all nature would be transformed, or as he put it, quote, nature itself will become artificial. In the end, man will have rebuilt the earth, if not in his own image, at least according to his taste. We have not the slightest fear that his taste will be bad, unquote. Idealists speak of the eternal poetry of earth, but Trotsky instructs, quote, the poetry of earth is not eternal. Man in socialist society will command nature in its entirety with its grouse and sturgeons, unquote. It became a famous phrase. Human beings will even redesign and improve their own bodies. Quote, the human race will not have ceased to crawl on all fours before God, kings, and capital in order later to submit humbly before the dark laws of heredity and a blind sexual selection, unquote. People will become stronger, more beautiful, more intelligent. Quote, the average human type will rise to the heights of an Aristotle, a Goethe, or a Marx, and above this ridge, new peaks will rise, unquote. Since natural laws are, of course, not suspended, the effect of such revolutionism was unprecedented environmental degradation. During the revolutionary period, it led to the death of millions. The promise that something beautiful must follow licenses all violence. Destruction seems like a good in itself. As that great lover of revolutionism, Bakunin, enthused, the will to destroy is also a creative will. Since liminality cannot go on forever, someone will eventually impose a new everyday reality. Natural and social laws return with, quite literally, a vengeance. Revolutionaries continue to say you cannot make an omelet without breaking eggs, but as the Russian economist Aron Katzenelnbogen liked to reply, well, we can see the broken eggs, the death of millions, but where is the omelet? Dr. Zhivago remarks, quote, the idea of social betterment, as it has been understood since the October Revolution, does not fill me with enthusiasm. I'm not sure that the paltry end justifies the means, unquote. Zhivago comments on the incapacity of those entranced by revolutionary euphoria to actually build something. He tells Lara, quote, it turns out that those who inspired the revolution aren't at home in anything except change and turmoil. For them, transitional periods, worlds in the making, are an end in themselves. They don't know anything but that. They're incompetent. Man is born to live, not to prepare for life. Life itself, the phenomenon of life, the gift of life, is so breathtakingly serious. So why substitute this childish harlequinade of immature fantasies, unquote. Life is also breathtakingly complex, beyond the reach of any theory. Zhivago explains, quote, when I hear people speaking of reshaping life, it makes me lose my self-control. Reshaping life. People who can say that have never understood a thing about life. They have never felt its breath, its heartbeat. Life is never a material, a substance to be molded. Life is constantly renewing and remaking and changing and transfiguring itself. It is infinitely beyond your or my obtuse theories about it, unquote. But revolutionism presumes that the perfect theory to explain everything has been found and must simply be applied. Once the regime is firmly established, the third kind of revolutionism takes hold. We can recognize it by a special kind of blindness it induces. The point is not just that people unwittingly or even wittingly close their eyes to every disconfirmation. No, they also make a virtue of the very act of blinding themselves. The ability to do so becomes a special Bolshevik virtue. Lyutov, in Babel's Red Cavalry stories, like Babel himself in his 1920 diary, on which the stories were based, struggles to keep his faith in revolution despite all evidence to the contrary. The soldiers' constant and often sincere use of terms like treason and counter-revolution to justify unnecessary brutality raises an obvious question. Is it reasonable to expect people who have spent their lives in violence to rule with compassion? Just defamiliarize the word revolution so as to see what it really means. Killing, destruction, and brutality, all conducted by what Babel calls, quote, wild beasts with principles, unquote. The question applies even more to professional revolutionaries like Lenin. The Red Cavalry stories trace the efforts of Lyutov not to see what he sees, to treat his doubts as his shortcomings, like his lack of the simplest abilities, the ability to kill another person, unquote. The most terrifying passages of Yevgenia Ginsburg's memoir, Into the Whirlwind, concern not the horrors of imprisonment, but the ability of prisoners to maintain faith in revolution. Even Gary Saul, whose last name had become a famous counter-revolutionary ism, insists, quote, "I was and I remain a Leninist. I swear by my 7th prison," unquote. Then there was the prisoner who had spent her whole life in the party and could not imagine doubting. After the horrors of interrogation, she needed to talk to someone and chose Ginsburg as another party member. Quote, "Shh, Jenny, my dear, I don't want the non-communists to hear me. They might get the wrong idea," unquote. As if she were not a convicted enemy of the people herself, she cautions Ginsburg that another prisoner is a genuine class enemy. Yet another former party member asks Ginsburg for help deciding whether to denounce a prisoner concealing jewelry. Quote, "It's disgusting, but on the other hand, this is a Soviet prison, and for all I know, she may be a real enemy," unquote. Ginsburg asks, quote, "And what about you and me, Katya?" Only to get the standard reply, quote, "You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs," unquote. Then there is Julia, who still believes that there really are millions of anti-Soviet agents. Quote, "Do you know what's happening in this country?" she asks. "Treason, appalling treason, which has worked its way into every link of the party and government apparatus," unquote. Ginsburg replies, quote, "But if everyone is supposed to have betrayed one man, isn't it simpler to think that he has betrayed them?" unquote. Julia went pale and said tersely, "I'm sorry, I made a mistake in talking to you." Ginsburg also recalls Zimina, a candidate for the Supreme Soviet before becoming, quote, "the arch spy Zimina." The two shared their horror that whole strata of the population were being removed. Only after conversing with Zimina for 2 years did Ginsburg discover, quote, "on our way to Kolyma," that in spite of everything, she worshipped Stalin, unquote, and wrote verses praising him. Nor was this unusual. Quote, "At the camp, I was to come across many people who managed strangely to combine a sane judgment of what was going on in the country with a truly mystical personality cult of Stalin," unquote. What is the mental mechanism that makes this possible? Ginsburg speaks of, quote, "the mystical power of slogans," unquote, that hypnotize thought. She learns a mechanism grounded in Marxist-Leninist theory from one Yaroslavsky, whom she calls the conscience of the party. Quote, "Yaroslavsky first explained to me the theory which became popular in 1937 that when you get down to it, there is no difference between subjective and objective. Whether you had committed a crime or inadvertently added grist to another's mill, you were equally guilty, even if you had not the slightest idea of what was going on," unquote. Thus, when Ginsburg was accused of participating in Kirov's assassination and proved that she was not even in Leningrad at the time, that made no difference because she was objectively guilty. When I was growing up, someone told me that the best translation of the word objectively in Marxist-Leninism is subjectively. It should be apparent that such thinking makes any counter-evidence inconceivable. Applied to oneself, it makes it possible to know both one's own innocence and the party's correctness at the same time. Of course, the concept of dialectical reasoning specifically allowed for self-contradiction. It presumably suggested Orwell's concept of doublethink. Ginsburg describes how, as a dedicated Leninist with unshakable faith in the party, she gradually entertained questions. Quote, For the first time in my life, I was faced by the problem of having to think things out myself, of analyzing the circumstances and deciding my own attitude, unquote. She is 30 years old, and she has not once thought things out for herself? Ginsburg's admiring readers often fail to notice that she never quite frees herself from this blindness. To the end of the book, she cannot bring herself to question more than she has to. She remains a Leninist and retains her faith in the party. For her, the problem is Stalin, and that's all. The idea that in a one-party state, with no law to restrain whatever the party does, a Stalin is not exactly surprising, never occurs to her. She is also quite aware that according to Leninist doctrine, truth is whatever the party says it is, and morality is whatever the party finds expedient, while the assertion of any other standard is bourgeois idealism, if not rotten liberalism. When she tells an interrogator that she just wants to act according to conscience, he asks if she's some sort of Christian. When she replies, no, she just wants to be honest, quote, he gave me a lecture on the Marxist-Leninist view of ethics. Honest meant useful to the proletariat and its state, unquote. Ginsburg never disputes that this is precisely what Leninism entails. In chapter 39, she is still able to write, quote, and yet, even now, after everything that had happened to us, would we have voted for any regime other than the Soviet, the one that had grown as close to us as our hearts and as natural as breathing? All I had, the thousands of books I had read, the memories of my youth, I owed to the revolution, unquote. Does she really think she could not have read those books under the Mensheviks? In the first volume's postscript, written after Khrushchev's de-Stalinization, she affirms her unshaken faith in, quote, the great Leninist truth, unquote. How different is she from Julia, who maintained the great Stalinist truth? Ginsburg has been clear that her Leninist beliefs entail her full approval of collectivization as one of the, quote, basic points of the party line, unquote. Collectivization, of course, included, as she knew, the liquidation of the kulaks as a class and the ruin of millions. In chapter 30, Ginsburg, suffering from mortal terror and indignation, exclaims, quote, what do you think you're doing to people? To communists, you devils, unquote. To communists. The millions of non-communists do not matter so much. Tellingly, Twardowski observed, quote, she only noticed that there was something wrong when they started jailing communists. She thought it quite natural when they were exterminating the peasantry, unquote. When her book ends, her affirmation of Leninism sounds to me like the end of 1984. She loved Big Brother. In Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate, Krimov, a convinced party man, wonders how all those people who had helped Lenin create the party could have been spies. And why, if he could not believe that Bukharin was a saboteur, had he raised his hand in support of the charge? No dedicated communist he knew had ever objected to obvious lies. There was Koloskov, who had come from a country village and cried his eyes out about the horrors of collectivization, quote, about the terrible hunger, about the ruthlessness with which the peasants' last grain of corn had been confiscated, unquote. Yet he had also written an article claiming, quote, that kulaks felt a violent hatred for everything new and were burying their grain in the ground, unquote. If the answer for such behavior were simply, the reason for it was simply fear, there would be no mystery. But Grossman has a more profound point to make. Not only fear is involved. Krimov understands that he and Koloskov did not, quote, act out of cowardice, unquote. In spite of all the contradictory evidence, the two of them were not lying. Quote, he had always believed what he said in his speeches and articles. He was still convinced that his words were a true reflection of his beliefs, unquote. Krimov realizes that he sincerely believes contradictory things. Can it be, he asks himself, quote, that I am a man with two consciences? or that I am two men, each with his own conscience, unquote. The doubling of the conscience, which destroys the integrity of the person, is a crucial aspect of revolutionism. Krymov also wonders why he and other party members had nothing to do with the families of arrested comrades, while illiterate old ladies took in their orphans. Quote, were these old women braver and more honorable than old Bolsheviks, unquote? Krymov arrives at an insight similar to Nadezhda Mandelstam's. Quote, fear alone cannot achieve all this. It was the revolutionary cause itself that freed people from morality in the name of morality. This was why it was right for a woman, because she had failed to denounce an innocent husband, to be torn away from her children and sent for 10 years to a camp. People's fear of death had been joined with the magic of revolution, unquote. My listeners may have noticed that everyone I have discussed, the Mandelstams, Gershon Zon, Pasternak, Trotsky, Babel, Ginsburg, and Grossman, was of Jewish background. Grossman explicitly wonders at how so many Jews became possessed of what he calls, quote, the mystical worship and adoration of revolution, unquote, even at those times when the governing ideology demanded the persecution of Jews. So let me ask, are Jews especially susceptible to revolutionism? Either because of a history of persecution or the debt Jewish thought owes to the prophetic tradition? That would be unfortunate, because whenever the magic revolution divides the world into the good and the evil, Jews, as Babel notes in his diary, will be subject to special violence. And yet, we could also ask whether another Jewish characteristic, their skepticism, logic, and doubt, might restrain the first. I certainly hope so. Thank you.
Part of how we imagine things involves sound. We imagine how we might sound, how other people might sound in the future, how we and others sounded in the past. For instance, in year one of the Russian Revolution, whether that's 1917 or 18. These future or past sounds take on meaning for us. We enjoy them or fear them or dislike them based on our own earlier experiences with sounds. What I want to do in my 20 minutes is to discuss the sound of Jewish voices and how that took on meaning in the periods before and after the revolution. My talk is in 3 parts. First, I'll talk about the idea of Jewish register or Jewish speech style. Second, I'll give some evidence about how people imagine Jewish speech during and around the revolution. And third, I'll talk about the changing meanings of Jewish revolutionary voice, especially the voice of Trotsky, and I'm glad people have already been talking about Trotsky, and I'll play some Trotsky for you. I'll argue, if the PowerPoint works, I'll argue that the sound of the Jewish voice took on meaning as the revolution approached. People imagined Jewish voices as playing a distinctive role during the revolutionary soundscape, and in retrospect, they looked back on the revolution and thought in various ways about how Jewish voices had sounded during it. So first, the idea of Jewish register. This talk is about a topic that I sometimes find people react to as though it were slightly taboo. The idea that Jews speak, either sometimes or always, in a distinctive and recognizable way. The idea that there's such a thing as Jewish speech style or Jewish register in languages that are not historically Jewish themselves. So I'm not talking about Hebrew or Yiddish or Ladino, but about Jewish English or Jewish Russian. How many of you think there is such you can recognize someone as Jewish from how they speak English? Yes. So this is a question that's been studied by literature scholars and especially sociolinguists. And I'm going to take you now through a few important theories about Jewish speech. So first, there's the idea that Jews don't really sound different. It's just people who are invested in Jewish difference, especially anti-Semites, who want to hear Jews as different, and therefore they do. The boundary of the difference of the Jew, or the literary critic Sander Gilman says that people work, quote, to create an absolute boundary of the difference of the Jew, even as this boundary historically shifts and slides. Jews sound different because they are represented as being different. Another idea. Maybe Jews, or at least some Jews, do speak in a distinctive way, especially Jews who come from places where there are a lot of Jews. The linguist Deborah Tannen studies Jews from New York and finds that their speech has certain characteristics: fast pacing, interruption, emphasis on the speaker's emotions, expressive paralinguistics, and what is perceived as high volume. Another linguist, also named Deborah Safran, finds something similar. She demonstrates that Jewish English, and she's studying Philadelphia, is characterized by a preference for argument and disagreement, for, quote, the use of openly competitive forms of talk as part of sociability. Another theory: maybe Jews and other people speak in distinctive ways some of the time, not all of the time. They perform Jewish register when they want to. The sociolinguist Sarah Bunin-Benor argues that Jewish speech style is wielded selectively by Jews and non-Jews. Quote, Jews in any given time and place make selective use of their distinctive repertoire in combination with the repertoires used by non-Jews as they construct their identity. This notion allows the use of more or less distinct language by any Jew or non-Jew. So I want to give you an example of the enregisterment of Jewish Russian. It's from the film Commissar, produced in 1967, released only in 1988, set during the Russian Civil War, right after the revolution. A Red Army officer comes to Yefim Magazinik, who's the guy on the left, and he's a shtetl Jew, and the officer says, I'm billeting this other Red Army officer with you and your family of 6 children, and Yefim is not happy. It's actually a really great film, and I really recommend it. What you're going to see is a Russian actor playing Yefim Magazinov, Roland Bykov. His mother is Jewish, and what he's doing, what you're going to see him doing, is performing Jewish Russian with the emotionality, gestures, combativeness, loudness, and prolixity. If I get this to work.
Товарищ Магазинник, что это уже за жизнь, когда вдруг тобой начинает интересоваться гор кому надел, дай ему Бог здоровья. Будем теснить, товарищ Магазинник. Теснить будем. Мама! Мария! Дети! Люди! Вот кому надел думает, что я Ротшильд? Нахальство этих макачей. Уже нет больше буржуев. Одна только комната осталась для советской власти. У жестянщика-магазинника. Мы вас считали сознательным, а вы проявляете себя наоборот. Нет, только у рабочего, у которого 6 человек, детей, советская власть должна отобрать комнату. А у авиационного колесчика? У суконщика Ходорова, вот у первого миллионщика Ашкенази. Мадам военная, товарищ военный.
So I'm sorry you didn't see the gestures, but I think you got a sense from the sound of how Yefim Magazinik, or how Roland Bykov is performing a kind of Jewish register. So that was part 1. Now I want to turn to part 2, listening to Jewish register during and around year 1. So leading up to year 1, 19-teens was a time when intellectuals in Russia were paying a lot of attention to speech and speech style. And I'm especially thinking about the Russian formalists who are obsessed by oral language. When the revolution broke out, these thinkers found it even more urgent to understand non-standard, non-elite language, and to think about how that could inspire verbal art. One of them, Boris Eichenbaum, defines the concept of skaz, meaning prose fiction where the narrator speaks in non-standard language that's identified with a lower-class group. Eichenbaum wrote about skaz in 1918, maybe year 1, quote, for our crazy, but at the same time creative era, the return to the living word is typical. So I think we can see Eichenbaum as explaining how it feels to be inside the process that Asif Aga describes. And I think both the process of enregisterment and the ability to convey the sense that some other group in society speaks in a distinctive way and this matters, these rely on 2 phenomena: an awareness that you're living at a time of social change and the rise of mass media with broad purview. And all this, of course, grows stronger in the revolutionary era. So this relates to the question of how year 1 is imagined in relation to the Jews of the Russian Empire. If we think about this question in the context of sound studies, maybe we can think about Jewish speech growing more audible than it had been before. Jews, finally freed from the restrictions of the Pale of Settlement, move in big numbers into the big cities and into earshot of Russian listeners. And then the sounds that they produced perhaps begin to signify the revolution itself. All of this suggests that the notion of the distinctive sound of Jewish speech is part of how year one was imagined, both at the time, soon after, and also long afterwards. It's how that year was imagined both positively and negatively, both by Jews and non-Jews, by philo-Semites and anti-Semites. This is an argument for paying attention to sound. It helps us understand the experience of year one and everything that would come to mean afterwards. It provides ways for people to continue to work through and try to understand the meaning of an event 100 years ago that we've come together to mark, an event that changed history for the world, for Russia, and for its Jews. Thanks.
In late 1919, American officials deported the anarchist leader Alexander Berkman to revolutionary Russia, giving him the opportunity to see for himself what was transpiring, not least amongst his fellow Jews. In Kiev, which the Bolsheviks had conquered a half year earlier, Berkman discovered that amidst the sufferings and privations of the previous years, substantial numbers of Ukraine's Jews had found the energy to attempt a genuine Jewish cultural revolution. Actually, Berkman discovered two Jewish cultural revolutions playing out in Kiev. The first was a Yiddishist one that had burst into life long before the Bolsheviks took power. It had been led by a circle of writers who had made Kiev a center of Yiddishist aesthetic and ideological experimentation well before World War I. Since early 1917, working across party lines, these men and women had striven to create a Yiddish language secular culture in which art and worldly creativity would be the highest values, and to disseminate this new Jewish culture to the putative Jewish folk in whose name it was being created through journals, publishing houses, and grand programs of Yiddishist cultural education for adults and children, coordinated by the Ukraine-wide Kulturliga, the Culture League. So that was the first revolution underway. But by the time Berkman arrived in Kiev in late 1919, a second project was cannibalizing the first. As he put it, quote, "The communists frown upon the too nationalistic character of this work. The Jewish branch of the party is particularly antagonistic." And in this context, newly minted Jewish communists, with regime support, were proclaiming a properly revolutionary Jewish culture, expropriating parts of the Yiddishist endeavor and suppressing the rest, along with all other forms of Jewish expression from traditional Judaism to modern Hebrew culture. What Berkman was seeing in Kiev then were traces of what had been the most ambitious endeavor to forge a modern Jewish culture that Eastern Europe had seen or would see again, and not only in Ukraine, but across and beyond Russian space, and not only in Yiddish, but also in a competing mirror image world of Hebrew efforts. In the two thrilling, terrifying years following February, Hebrew and Yiddish literati from across the political spectrum had organized omnibus literary journals, avant-garde anthologies, massive translation projects through some dozen publishing houses, all with unprecedented popular engagement, drawing in leading Jewish artists, composers, and theater folk who had previously thought of themselves as creators of Russian culture. Hebraists and Yiddishists moved to carve out distinct realms of Jewish plastic art, orchestral music, and theater, a Jewish secular culture spanning the full Renaissance system of the arts. Some years ago, I wrote a book about this outpouring of cultural activity, and I was as fascinated as anyone else with the unparalleled artistic efflorescence of the moment, but I was more interested in the no less audacious ideas and ideals concerning what Jewish culture was and could be, ideas that, as I discovered, shaped this artistic efflorescence, root and branch. In the course of that research, I also came to a series of conclusions that might seem somewhat perverse for a conference on the 100th anniversary of October. First, that the Jewish cultural efflorescence of this moment had much less to do with October's ideals than with February's freedoms, that it was in that brief moment when Jewish cultural life was finally free of Tsarist restrictions, as of February, Yet before it was subjected to October's dictates, which broadly speaking means mid-1918 in Russia proper, mid-1919 in Ukraine, it was in that brief moment that these ideas were expressed most fully. And second, I concluded that while February allowed the new Jewish cultural vision to express itself fully, this new Jewish culture was not born of February any more than it was born of October. February unfettered a cultural endeavor that had been in the making for 30 years. Now, I assume everyone in an audience at YIVO knows broadly what I mean when I speak of a new Jewish culture, stretching back to the 1880s. The effort by initially small, but growing numbers of young Jewish men and women to create a new kind of Jewish culture founded on pan-European secular humanist ideals regarding art, thought, and creativity that was supposed to replace traditional Judaism, overcome ongoing assimilation to Russian or Polish culture, and to serve as the ground for a new Jewish identity, for a putative Jewish folk, which was itself to be recast in the process. But this general description does not in any way capture the audacity, both aesthetic and ideological, of this effort to create a new type of Jewishness, or the creativity and seriousness with which it confronted the deep tensions built into the modern idea of culture, tensions between obligation and freedom, community and individuality, tradition and rebellion. What was this new Jewish culture meant to be at heart? A first sense of its humanist scope, openness to paradox, and audacity, both aesthetic and ideological, is crystallized in one especially interesting object here. A Yiddish translation of Hans Christian Andersen's stories, translated by the Yiddish symbolist Der Nister, illustrated by El Lisitsky during his brief but serious engagement with the idea of serving Jewish culture with his art, and published by a Kulturliga-affiliated press for Ukraine's Jewish children, the Kiever Verlag. The cooperation of a Yiddish writer and an artist previously oriented toward the larger Russian modernist scene bespeaks the ideal of a Jewish culture, an aesthetic culture spanning all of the arts. The coordinated creation of Yiddish-language children's literature by the Kulturliga in dozens of titles bespeaks the drive to bring the new secular culture to the nation as a whole. Perhaps the real headline is the choice of Andersen. Why choose to translate, publish, and distribute the quite un-Jewish Hans Christian Andersen as a component of a new Yiddish culture? The quiddity deepens when we learn more about Der Nister's lovely translation. I believe I first learned this from Dovorowski's work. Der Nister made no effort to Judaize or de-Christianize Andersen. He kept his references to churches and Christian ritual, and in so doing, broke with the hoary tradition that the late Hona Shmerek described of most previous Yiddish translation practice, which was to remove Christian references or even to replace them with Jewish equivalents, to make it more Hamish. It stands to reason, right? But Nister did not do this. Now, what does all of this have to do, with our topic today and tomorrow, with Jews and the revolution? And the answer is, to be perverse about it, not nearly as much as one might think. Nister and Lisitsky themselves eventually did come to embrace October, Lisitsky sooner, Nister later, and did so, in fact, more than even most of their colleagues in the same circles. But nothing about this undertaking was a product of that. Nister had been keen to translate Silver Age icons like Andersen since well before 1917. Lisitsky came to his brief but intense engagement with the idea of Jewish culture at the latest in early 1917, under the influence of the Yiddish modernist and cultural entrepreneur Moshe Broderzon, producing illustrations not only for Yiddish, but also Hebrew. Here we have his illustrations for a Bialik reworking of a Midrash, Hebrew stories, as well as Russian language Judaica between 1917 and 1919. Lisitsky put it thus in an April 1918 letter to the Yiddish literary critic Shmuel Niger, quote, and here we have his Russian afterword, it's a letter from Broderzon, "I want to express to you my happiness that we are approaching the time of the new Jewish book, a book created with love toward it itself and toward the coming culture whose bricklayers we wish to be." And this is, by the way, a treasure, one of the many treasures here in the YIVO archive in the Shmuel Niger collection. Further suggesting the secondary relevance of the revolution in all of this, and a matter of great importance in itself, is the fact that when we look across the chasm that divided the Jewish secular cultural milieu into two bitterly competing camps, one Yiddishist and one Hebraist, we find almost exact and complete parallels to everything we have seen in Nister and everything that Berkman found in Yiddishist Kiev on the Hebraist side. In 1917, indeed already in 1916, Hebraists undertook to create or refound great publishing houses, literary journals, and hundreds of Hebrew schools across Russia and Ukraine. They worked to attract the same artists as the Yiddishists for their publications. So here we have Natan Altman as an illustrator for the seal of what was to be a major children's book project. And as I showed you before, we have Lisitsky illustrating a Bialik text no less than a Nister text. So they created a vast umbrella organization called Tarbut, also culture, which coordinated the dissemination of all these efforts, and in some ways Kulturliga was probably founded on that model. Most importantly, this Hebraist project was not only similar on the surface to the Yiddishist one, it was also pervasively shaped by the same rather strange assumptions and ideals regarding culture itself, regarding what it would take to create a worthwhile, compelling, new Jewish culture for a transformed Jewish nation. So what were the assumptions and ideals that pervaded this doubled Yiddish and Hebrew cultural project that blossomed in 1917? I'll underscore, delineate 5. First, the new culture had to reach beyond the limits of Jewish themes and traditions for its content and forms. As one Yiddishist put it, quote, "Our literature has by now entirely exhausted the spring of its traditional, folksy Jewish themes and motifs, and it has for its own sake to incorporate the fundamental motifs and moods, visions and images, symbols and figures, legends and myths of the world poetry of all generations, peoples, and languages." The same conviction drove the leading Hebraist publishing venture of the era. The Shtibo Publishing House in Moscow recruited virtually every Hebrew writer of note, and a fair number of not so much note, to translate canonical texts from the Greek Anacreon to Wilde, Maeterlinck, and Strindberg. The grandly endowed Omanut Press, founded by later Knesset member Shoshana Persitz, emphasized, quote, storybooks and tales for children from the best of world literature, including, again, Wilde, Daudet, Korean folk tales. Translation, importantly, was a special obsession, a special commitment of the most nationally minded and nationalist activists, Josef Klausner, the right-leaning and eventually quite right-wing editor of Hashiloach, greeted a 1918 translation of Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray as a national breakthrough for Jews, precisely because, quote, as the first complete Hebrew translation of a story that has no connection to Jews, it helped bring the new Hebrew culture beyond the limits of Jewish parochialism. Second, culture had to be insulated from political struggle and its dictates, at least to some degree, in order to grow into something compelling. Thus, despite the fact that almost all of the Jewish cultural activists we're encountering here had very strong political convictions and were often party members of some sort, they mostly insisted that the cultural institutions they themselves created should be independent of parties and make common cause across political lines. This was true, for instance, of both the Kulturliga and Tarbut. Third, the new culture had to be disseminated to the whole of the nation, or for the socialists, to the democratic part of the nation that would, through thanks to history, eventually become the whole nation. But the culture to be disseminated had to be the real thing, not some ersatz designed to instill identity and obedience in the masses. The Kulturliga tried to ensure that it would disseminate, quote, not cheap peddlers' merchandise, but rather products of fundamental worth, because bringing culture to the masses does not mean giving them something unacceptable to oneself. Fourth, perhaps most audacious, to use that word again, it's somehow gone out of our vocabulary, but it came back into this paper. The new culture had to liberate the Jewish individual from any specific demands in the name of any Jewish identity, religious or national. Writing in 1918 Kiev for a mainstream Hebraist audience, the 22-year-old Hebraist Zionist activist, later author, Natan Bystritsky, argued that the Hebraist cultural revolution would fail unless it led to Shichrur HaPrat, the liberation of the individual from any identity demands. Quote, the nation takes on a great obligation toward the individual. It must promise to the creative individual complete freedom. It must liberate the individual from all external claims which prescribe some sort of goal for the creative work. Now, why was this liberation so vital? It wasn't just a moral issue. It was a practical one for Bystritsky. Without this freedom from identity, no worthwhile or compelling culture, he was sure, could be created. Quote, only if the individual personality finds itself in an environment of spiritual freedom, and no spiritual or philosophical yoke oppresses its soul, only then can it proceed on the royal road of full and unblemished creation, end quote. Now, fifth and finally, as we offer this kind of fillet of the cultural project, the fundament that underpinned all of these was the deep conviction that the only way to sustain a worthwhile Jewish culture was to do so in a single Jewish language that would be adequate to the needs of all the needs of modern persons. The key here was an understanding shared by these Yiddishists and Hebraists, and this is the reason there was no room for compromise, by the way. There was no room for compromise precisely because they shared the same view of culture and language, actually. The key here was an understanding of language, not as a closed system, bearing some sort of distinct Jewish essence, Yiddish humor, Hebrew prophetic profundity or something, but as a kind of infinitely expandable and semi-permeable container that would preserve in perpetuity all creative acts in Hebrew or Yiddish, whether traditional or modern, whether indigenous or brought in by translation, and that would make them available in this language to all further users of the national language in perpetuity. In a society where a separate Jewish language was already dominant in all spheres of life and no longer needed to be defended or protected, Jewish culture would no longer be threatened by contact with foreign cultures, but enriched through ongoing translation. It would produce an ever-evolving distinct Jewish culture, not by fiat, this is what Jewish content is, but simply by open-ended cumulation. Jews would come to be, quote, like every people which lives its natural life and spins the thread of its creativity unintentionally and without particular goals, end quote, as Bystrzycki put it. With a separate language as its only law, the new Jewish culture might be as wide as humanity, but also self-contained and self-sustaining. Now, each of these 5 ideals sounds fragile, and none could be realized fully, of course, but none was mere lip service at this juncture. These ideals shaped, incompletely but deeply, what Jewish cultural activists did as writers and artists, educators, and institution builders. Thus, these impacts had very real impact on teaching in the newly unfettered Hebraic and Yiddish school systems, both of which now emphasized, even more than they had previously, creative expression rather than the sorts of essentialist, catechistic education we normally associate with nationalism. The leading theorist of Hebrew nursery education, Yud Halperin, instructed teachers, quote, "The Hebrew nursery is not a factory to teach the Hebrew language, nor a workshop to produce little Zionist souls. The idea that gives it the right to exist, the principal goal in all modern education, is to awaken in children the power of creation." And across the battle lines that separated Hebraists and Yiddishists, the view was the same. As one Yiddish teacher in the provinces put it, quote, "The life joy of encompassing everything and creating is, after all, the ultimate end of ends," end quote. Now, one further point helps to explain the seriousness with which these actors pursued these ideals. By 1917, all of them clearly felt that these ideals were not a luxury, much less intellectual paradox, but a necessity if one wanted a Yiddish or Hebrew culture that could actually attract and hold modern and especially young Jews. In 1918, the Hebrew activist Aleph Litai, later a founder of the Haaretz newspaper, greeted the Shtibel Publishing House's vast translation project thus: "The literature of the world, God Almighty, is this not the thing longed for by the soul of all those Hebrews who aspire to spiritual wholeness?" A year earlier, in January 1917, he had written that his generation would not accept, quote, "intellectual celibacy," end quote, if Hebrew culture did not expand to meet all the needs of a generation that was already modern, already worldly, already multilingual, then they would abandon it, and the national project would fail. The timing of Litai's last observation, made not only before October, but also before February, brings me to my last point. None of the cultural principles that I just outlined, not the urgency that underpinned them, and none of the principles, was created by the Russian Revolution, however one understands the term. As that most pro-revolution of Yiddish poets, Peretz Markish, remarked, quote, "Many measure us with the measure of the current revolution. That's incorrect. It was an accidental happy meeting," end quote. Happy for him, but accidental for all of them. All of the ideals I've been describing have been crystallizing in the Jewish secular national cultural sphere for years before February. And that is why most Jewish culturists, when you go back and look, experienced February more as an unfettering than as a rupture. Not Stunde Null, right? As Shoshana Persitz put it in April 1917, addressing her fellow Hebraists, now all the external obstacles on the path of our work have been cleared away. Right? Now we can do what we mean to do for years. These ideas were not only present in the pre-revolutionary cultural sphere, by 1917 they had been moving from the margins to the mainstream for years. The argument that the cultural sphere had to be insulated from party politics if it were to grow had already burst into the mainstream in the middle of the first decade of the 20th century. For instance, in 1908, when the Yiddish journal Literarische Monatsschriften had asserted that a Jewish cultural renaissance demanded the unification of all creative forces across party lines, and embodied this by drawing its editors from clashing Bundist, Zionist, and socialist territorialist movements, which many Jewish socialists found horrifying, but many younger Yiddishists from Vilna to Lodz were quite thrilled. As for the drive to liberate Hebrew or Yiddish art from having to always express Jewishness, or as Yosef Chaim Brenner put it, the drive to liberate Jewish literature from the Sodom bed of Jewishness, that too was completely mainstream in both movements by 1914. In 1896, the Hebrew writer Ben Avigdor had inaugurated a major world literature translation series. Avram Reisen had founded a Yiddish journal for translations from European literature called creatively European Literature in 1907. By 1913, the young Max Weinreich was publishing translations from the Iliad and Gilgamesh in the leading Yiddishist cultural journal, Vilna's Yiddische Welt, that strove, like Nister would with Anderson, to avoid traditional Yiddish intertexts and preserve the foreignness of the original by keeping Homer's dactylic hexameter, which is quite foreign to the Yiddish ear, and I have a little bit of it here. Otazoi haben die Treuer gewacht und a gewaltige Eme hat die Acher befallen, geworfen in Eisigen Yish. Right? This is not your mother's folk song or your father's folk song. Finally, what of the idea that the new Yiddish or Hebrew culture had to free Jewish individuals from the bonds of any mandated Jewish identity or limit other than language itself? In 1892, Michael Yosef Berdichevsky had demanded complete freedom of theme in Jewish letters. Quote, "We wish to be Hebrew humans in one spirit. We feel a great and fundamental need to heal the terrible fissure in our heart." But this had been a cry of anguish from the margins in 1892. In 1896, when Achad Am founds HaShiloach, he tells people right off the bat, "I only want literary submissions that, quote, contribute to the awakening of thought and the spreading of the national idea among us. I don't want anything that's merely about beauty." Yeah? But by 1903, HaShiloach, the flagship journal of Hebraism, was in the hands of the aforementioned Yosef Klausner, whose new mission statement declared, quote, "When we force the Jewish writer to speak only about matters which relate to Jewishness, we compel our authors to deny and suppress many human thoughts and emotions, and where there is no wholeness, no great talents can develop. There is no solution other than to remove the divider between Jewishness and universality." This is not Gorky, this is Yosef Klausner, right? At the same time, even as the aging Peretz was writing about the need for Yiddish writers to go back to the Bible, Yiddish writers too were coming to believe, as Nachman Meisel put it, that, quote, "literature and art must express the entire sweep of experiences, problems, and woes of the modern Jew who lives in the wide world, who is deeply and organically both Jew and man." What then of the revolution? February lent urgency and optimism to this cultural endeavor, but did not create it. As for October, others here know more about October than I do. It seems to me that October undermined the most fundamental principles of this cultural project, insofar as culture could no longer claim a superpolitical significance, it could no longer claim neutral public space, and most fundamentally, most pervasively, intellectuals and writers should not regard themselves under October's aegis as free to generate culture as they wished, but rather, of course, had to do so in accordance with the demands of an unfolding this-worldly redemption as interpreted by authorized interpreters within the party state and its church. But October did not have the last word. The Jewish cultural project outlived October in interwar Poland in certain ways, and in Yiddish New York for one more generation, in Mandate Palestine's Yishuv, and thereafter, above all, in Israel. In those settings, its ideals were, and often are, trammeled by communal need, recruited, deformed by essentialist nationalism, but they retained, perhaps retain, real power and continued to bear fruit. They underpinned the Yiddish creativity of Monger, Molodovsky, even the cynic Bashevis. And by the same token, without these ideals, there would have been no Leah Goldberg, Natan Alterman, or for that matter, Avot Yeshurun, Yonah Wallach, or Syed Kashua, figures who, regardless of the views of Zionism, renewed and renew an open-ended Hebrew culture every day. Now, what will happen to this ideal now, amidst the vicious chauvinism of the Miri Regevs on the one hand and the religious racism of the Yitzhak Ginsburgs on the other, is a different question. As for American Jews, maybe we too can find something enlivening in what the cultural project has left us, perhaps especially in the Yiddish lobe that flowered here at the hands of Glotstein, Margolin, Laelis, and others. For now, as we reflect on the 100th anniversary of October, perhaps it is also worth noting that not only is this year the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, it's also the 100th anniversary of Mendele's death, founding figure of the Hebrew and Yiddish novel, the 125th anniversary of Shaul Chernyakhovsky's first poem, Yonatan Geffen's 70th birthday, 20th year since Rona Kanan's debut performance, and 80 years since Avram Sutzkever's first book of poetry. Thank you.